I'll write this in the analyzed style. Let me draft it carefully to hit the word range and structure. The fever had broken my sense of the room. I remember the ceiling seemed to move, the way water moves, and I was too weak to lift my own head from the pillow. It was the middle of winter in Geauga County, and the fire downstairs had burned low. I was 20 years old, married 11 months, and I could not tell you whether it was afternoon or night. My whole body was one long ache, and through the fog of it, I heard boots on the stairs. My husband. And I remember thinking, in that broken, feverish way, please just let him bring water, please just let him let me rest. But that is not what he had come upstairs to ask for. Before I go any further, I'm Martha, and this is Hannah, the Amish girl. I grew up old order Amish, and now I share the stories we were never allowed to speak out loud, the things that happened behind the plain curtains that no tourist buggy ride will ever show you. If you want the truth about Amish life from someone who actually lived inside it, not the postcard version, subscribe and tap the like button. And in the comments, tell me one thing. In your world, when a wife is sick, what is a husband allowed to ask of her? I want to know what normal looks like where you come from, because for a long time I did not know that mine was not normal. Let me explain something before I tell you the rest, because without it you will not understand how a thing like this happens, how it happens quietly, in a warm house with a good fire and food in the cellar, and nobody ever raises their voice. Amish marriage rests on an idea that is spoken about constantly and examined almost never. The idea is headship. The husband is the head of the home the way, we were taught, Christ is the head of the church. The wife yields. That word yields was stitched into me before I could spell it. Gelassenheit, we call it, the giving up of the self, the laying down of your own will. In the outside world, people hear submission and picture something dramatic. It is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is 1,000 small mornings of putting your own needs last until you genuinely cannot remember you were ever allowed to have them. And here is the piece that outsiders miss entirely. A wife's duties in an Amish marriage do not pause when she is sick. There is no clause for that. The cows do not stop needing milking because you have a fever. The bread does not rise itself. And in the private matters of marriage, the intimate matters, the same rule was understood to apply, though nobody ever said it in daylight. A wife was expected to be available to her husband. That was framed to us not as his desire, but as her duty and even her calling. To refuse was not just to disappoint a man. It was, we were taught, to fail at the very thing God made you a wife to do. Nobody handed me these rules on paper. There is no page in the Ordnung, our unwritten code, that says a husband may demand this or that. That is exactly the point. The absence of the written rule is what makes it so powerful. Everything is understood, everything is assumed, and a rule you cannot point to is a rule you cannot argue against. I married Amish in the spring. I was 19. He was 24, broad through the shoulders, quiet in the way that people mistook for gentleness, and I mistook it that way too. Our courtship had been short, half a year of buggy rides and Sunday singings, of my sisters whispering in the next room. I thought I knew him. What I knew was the version of him that other people were watching. I had not yet met the version of him that only appeared when the doors were closed and it was just the two of us, and no one in the whole world could see. The first months were ordinary. I cooked, I cleaned, I learned his likes. I fell into the rhythm of a farm wife. And then that winter I got sick, not a small sickness, a fever that climbed and would not come down. That left me shaking under 3 quilts, that made my own skin feel like it belonged to someone else. My mother would have known what to do, but a married daughter does not run home. You belong to your husband's house now. So I stayed in that bed, and I burned. And on the worst night of it, Amish came up the stairs. He sat on the edge of the bed. He put his hand on my forehead, and for one moment I thought, there he is, there is the gentleness. And then he told me what he wanted. And when I turned my face away, when I said, "Amos, please, I am so sick, I cannot," he said the words I have carried for years. He said, "A wife does not get to be sick from this. This is the one thing you do not get to be too sick for." I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. And I know some of you are already deciding what kind of man he was. Let me tell you what I believe now, after years of turning it over. Amos did not think he was doing anything wrong. That is the part that took me the longest to understand and the part that still keeps me up some nights. He believed he was owed this. He believed the Ordnung, the church, God himself stood behind him in that room. He was not breaking the rules. He was following them exactly as they had been handed down to him. The cruelty was not that he was a monster. The cruelty was that the system had told a decent enough young man that this was his right, and had told me that my body was not a thing I was allowed to close. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform. Not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. I need you to understand that I did not think of it as wrong at the time. That is what the silence does. When you have no other words for a thing, you use the words you were given, and the words I was given were duty and yielding and a good wife. I lay there afterward staring at the low ceiling, and I did not think, my husband has wronged me. I thought, I have failed to be strong enough. I thought the fault was mine, that a truly faithful wife would not have wanted to say no, that my resistance was the sin and not his demand. Do you hear how backward that is? It took me years and a room far away from that farm to hear it myself. My sister-in-law, Rebecca, was the first crack in the silence. She was married to Amos's brother, and one afternoon we were canning tomatoes together, our hands red to the wrist, steam fogging the windows, when she said something so quietly I almost missed it. She said, "The winter I lost the baby, he still would not leave me be." She did not look up from the jars. She did not say another word about it. She just kept ladling. And I stood there with my heart pounding, because I understood exactly what she meant. And I understood that she had just handed me the most dangerous thing an Amish woman can hand another. The truth that it was not only me, that this was not my private failing, that it was happening in the house next door, and the house after that, behind every plain curtain on the road. We never spoke of it again directly, but something passed between us that day over those tomatoes that I have never forgotten. It was the first time in my marriage that I did not feel completely alone inside my own body. Here is what nobody outside understands about how the silence is kept. It is not kept by force. Nobody threatens you. It is kept by shame, which is far stronger than any lock. To speak of these things is immodest. To complain of your husband is prideful, Hochmut, the worst sin we knew. To suggest that the Ordnung had failed you was to suggest that the whole world your parents and grandparents built was rotten at the root, and what girl can bear to believe that? So you swallow it. You swallow it and you swallow it, and you tell yourself the swallowing is faith, and the church gave a wife nowhere to go. There was no one whose job it was to ask if you were all right. If you went to the bishop, a man, and told him your husband demanded too much of you, the answer you would receive was more scripture about submission, more counsel to yield, more reminders of your duty. The system did not have a door for a woman in my situation. It only had mirrors, and every mirror showed my own face and asked what was wrong with me. There were years, I will be honest with you, that were not like that worst night. Amos was not cruel every day. There were mornings he brought me coffee. There were evenings we sat on the porch and he told me his worries about the corn and the price of feed, and I loved him in the plain, tired way you love someone you have built a life beside. That is the part that makes it so hard to explain to people from the outside. It was not a horror every single day. It was worse than that, in a way. It was ordinary. It was woven into the ordinary, so that I could not pull the one black thread without unraveling my whole life. But the fever night never left me. It sat in the bottom of me like a stone in a well. And every time I got sick after that, and a farm wife gets sick, exhaustion is its own kind of fever, I felt that same cold dread, that my body was never fully mine to close, that even at my weakest there was one demand I did not get to be too weak for. I want to tell you about the day something shifted. It was years later. I had a daughter by then, a little girl of 4, and she was sick, burning up the way I once had. And I sat beside her small bed with a cool cloth, and I thought, without meaning to, about what her marriage might one day be. I thought about some young man on some stair, and some rule with no page, and my daughter learning to swallow it the way I had. And something in me that had been asleep for a very long time stood up. I could survive it for myself. I found I could not accept it for her. That was the beginning of my leaving. It was not fast and it was not clean. Leaving never is. When I finally went, the cost came all at once, the way it always does. The shunning. Letters returned unopened. My mother's voice going flat on the telephone the one time I called, as though I had already become a stranger to her. My father would not come to the door. The community that had raised me, fed me, sat beside me at every funeral and every wedding, closed like a fist. That is the price, and they make sure you pay it in full, because if leaving were cheap, more would leave. In the years since, in a small room with a woman who listened and did not flinch, I learned words I had never once heard spoken in 20 years of plain life. Consent, autonomy, coercion. The idea, so simple that I wept when I first truly understood it, that my body had always been mine, that yielding is only holy when it is freely chosen, and that a thing you cannot refuse is not a gift you are giving. It is something being taken. No matter how gently, no matter how quietly, no matter how many scriptures are read over the taking. I do not tell you this to make you hate the Amish. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to me. The plain world gave me things I will carry until I die. A community with a depth the outside world can barely imagine. Hands that showed up for every barn raising and every grave. A faith that, wounded as it is, I have rebuilt into something I can live inside. But there is no theology that requires a woman to lie sick and afraid in her own bed and call it obedience. There is no God I believe in now who made a woman's body and then decided she was not allowed to close her own door. If you grew up in a world where your silence was called faithfulness, where your exhaustion was called weakness, where a rule that was never written down still governed the most private parts of your life, then I am speaking to you now, and I want you to hear it plainly. Your body was always yours. It was yours on your worst night. It was yours when you were told it wasn't. And if no one in your whole life ever said those words to you, then let me be the one. I am saying them now. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.